African nations have found a way to trade in local currencies, which would reduce their dependency on the US dollar.
So the dollar's power in Africa has declined. And this is because the common market for Eastern and South Africa has recently launched a digital retail payment platform.
Now, Kenya's trade minister took to social media to hail the platform as a game changer.
And because trade is now becoming more digital than physical.
Is digging in. Americans are waking up to a whole new escalation in the global trade war. Beijing is hiking its retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods today from 84% to 125%. And for the first time since this all started, we're actually hearing from the Chinese President Xi Jinping himself. Xi's saying that his nation is, quote unquote, not afraid. And also,
Wall Street thought a December interest rate cut was practically guaranteed. The Federal Reserve had already cut twice this year. The official story is that inflation has cooled from its peak, and investors were betting that a third reduction was definitely on its way. But now, what once looked like a sure thing has collapsed into uncertainty. Inside the Fed itself,
imagine waking up to a world where the United States, once the uncontested giant of global trade, is suddenly locked out of an entire continent, not just any continent, but Africa, the world's fastest-growing economic frontier, the supplier of the minerals that power America's phones, the cocoa that sweetens its chocolate, the cobalt that fuels its electric cars, the oil that runs its industries, and the markets that absorb billions in American exports. Overnight, every trade route has gone silent. Ports that once welcomed U.S. shipments now sit closed. Cargo that was scheduled to leave African shores is frozen. Grain deals, canceled mineral contracts, suspended energy shipments, redirected. The United States is cut off instantly, brutally, without warning. And in Washington, chaos erupts. Phone lines burn, advisors panic, economists scramble for answers. And at the center of the storm, one man is absolutely livid. The former U.S. president who built his brand on dominance, control, and putting America first. But now he's watching, powerless, as Africa flips the script, because Africa isn't protesting, Africa isn't negotiating, Africa isn't pleading. Africa is done. For the first time in modern history, an entire continent has rejected a superpower not with weapons, but with trade, the single force that built America's global influence, and their message is unmistakable. Respect our resources, respect our people, respect our power, or stay out. What happened behind closed doors that triggered this overnight rupture? How did African nations gain the confidence to challenge the United States? And why are global markets trembling as Africa shuts its doors to America but opens them wide to Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America? This isn't just a trade dispute. This is a historic power shift, one the U.S. never believed was possible. Until it was too late. Welcome to the moment the world economy flips upside down.
2/3 of Americans now say the other political party is not just wrong, but a serious threat to the United States itself. Trust in the government has collapsed to just 22%, which is near historic lows. The middle class, the glue that holds this country together, has been absolute.
For better or for worse, African countries do not export much manufactured goods to the U.S. Typically, it's commodities, right? And as a result, the impact of the tariffs on some of those commodities, which are essential in many ways, whether it's oil or minerals, they're hard to substitute for. So I think, and they're also global markets for these commodities, so they can be rerouted to other markets. You have to remember the U.S. is, as a trading partner to Africa, is behind China and is behind the EU. And so in the commodity space, you can reroute it elsewhere. So I don't know that it'll be a huge impact. I think it's at once the best and worst thing about African countries and economies that we do not manufacture. We're not a manufacturing powerhouse. We don't export much. So the people feeling the impact of the tariffs most heavily directly are the Asian, the South Asian economies who have become in recent years significant exporters to the United States.
Ports are consistently ranked among the least efficient in the world. What sort of investment would it take to fix that?
The announcement came without warning, no diplomatic leaks, no quiet rumors, no gradual build-up, just a sudden, unmistakable declaration from a coalition of African nations. all trade partnerships with the United States were suspended effective immediately, not reviewed, not renegotiated, completely halted. Washington had never imagined such a unified stance, especially coming from a continent the U.S. had long assumed would remain economically dependent and politically predictable. But overnight, the map of global trade shifted, and Africa was at the center of the shock. The move was not impulsive, it was the result of months of closed door meetings between countries across West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, and the Horn. The discussions intensified as these nations evaluated the long-term consequences of their partnerships with Washington. What they found only deepened their resolve. For decades, the U.S. had pushed trade agreements that heavily favored American corporations, draining Africa's natural resources in exchange for minimal investment in local industries. Despite promises of development, the wealth gap widened and domestic markets remained vulnerable. African leaders began to realize that continuing under the same terms would lock the continent into economic stagnation for another generation. The tipping point emerged when several African commodity groups released reports showing staggering revenue losses caused by U.S. import caps and price manipulation. In nations rich with cocoa, coffee, and rare minerals, farmers and miners struggled under contracts that fixed prices far below market value. At the same time, American exporters increased shipments of heavily subsidized products, particularly maize, wheat, poultry, and machinery, undercutting African manufacturers. Domestic industries struggled to grow, unable to compete with artificially cheap imports. What Washington called support, African economists were now calling strategic economic suffocation. When these findings reached continental trade blocs, momentum began to shift. Countries started reconsidering their long-standing belief that the U.S. was indispensable. By the time the reports reached regional summits, the conversation had changed entirely. Instead of asking how to negotiate better deals with the U.S., leaders began asking whether they needed the U.S. at all. Compounding this sentiment was Africa's booming economic potential. Growing populations, expanding cities, rapid technological adoption, and new continental rail and port projects were signaling that the continent was entering a new economic era. African nations were no longer the resource-exporting economies of the past. They were becoming manufacturing hubs, digital technology centers, and regional logistic giants. For many policymakers, maintaining unequal trade agreements with Washington made less and less sense. The continent needed partners willing to invest in industrial capacity, not just extract raw materials. Meanwhile, pressure mounted as other global powers stepped in with more appealing offers. China expanded its Belt and Road projects, offering financing for refineries, industrial parks, and energy infrastructure. Gulf nations sought long-term agricultural and mineral partnerships that granted African countries full ownership of processing plants. Even South American countries proposed South-South cooperation models that prioritized equal trade benefits. As the world's geopolitical landscape became more multipolar, Africa gained unprecedented leverage. The decisive moment came when various African economic unions drafted a joint report analyzing the financial impact of a temporary freeze on U.S. trade. The calculations were shocking not for Africa, but for the U.S. African nations realized that many American industries were far more dependent on African imports than they had previously acknowledged. African countries supplied significant portions of America's cobalt, manganese, titanium, and critical minerals used in aerospace, electronics, and renewable energy manufacturing. On top of that, agricultural imports from Africa filled critical gaps in U.S. food supply chains, especially in coffee, cocoa, fruits, and specialty crops. But the real shock came from the data on shipping routes and logistics. African ports and airspace had become essential routes for American global supply chains. A halt in cooperation would force the U.S. to reroute shipments, increasing transportation costs, slowing industrial production, and destabilizing manufacturing schedules. Even more alarming for Washington, the analysis revealed that Africa's withdrawal from security cooperation agreements would increase operational expenses for U.S. bases and shipping convoys across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Armed with this knowledge, African nations understood they finally had the leverage they had never dared to use, and overnight they executed the boldest trade shift in modern history. The official statement was straightforward. African nations declared that U.S. partnerships were no longer aligned with the continent's developmental goals. Effective immediately, all trade agreements were suspended pending a full renegotiation under new terms that prioritized African industrialization, technology transfer, local production, and value addition. No more raw mineral exports without refinement, no more agricultural imbalances, no more subsidized American imports flooding African markets. Washington's response was instantaneous shock. Diplomats rushed to schedule emergency calls, but African governments stood firm. They informed the U.S. that discussions would only resume once a new framework respecting Africa's economic sovereignty was drafted. For the first time in modern trade history, Africa was dictating the conditions, not reacting to them. Within hours, global markets reacted. Commodity prices surged as traders anticipated shortages in the U.S., especially in mineral inputs critical for electric vehicles, defense technology, and energy systems. American agricultural giants issued internal warnings about sudden drops in export orders. Manufacturing firms began preparing for delays and increased production costs. Analysts on major financial networks described the situation as an unprecedented crisis, one that exposed the fragility of America's reliance on African resources. In Africa, the mood was entirely different. Streets across various capitals buzzed with pride and optimism. The continent was no longer waiting for Western approval. It was no longer functioning within a system designed to keep it dependent. It had exercised its collective power unapologetically, and the world could no longer ignore it. The halt in trade was not just an economic decision, it was a declaration of independence in the modern era. It was Africa asserting that it would no longer be boxed into the role of supplier while others controlled the global profits. It marked the beginning of an economic recalibration that would reshape global trade for decades. And for the United States, the consequences were only beginning. The shockwaves from Africa's suspension of U.S. trade rippled across the world with astonishing speed. Within 24 hours, Washington's economic teams were scrambling to analyze the magnitude of the crisis. The projections looked grim. Major sectors from agriculture and manufacturing to renewable energy faced immediate disruptions. African ports halted all U.S.-bound shipments, customs offices froze export documentation, and inspection agencies suspended the certification processes required for American-bound goods. What had once been a smooth, decades-old supply chain suddenly went silent. Inside the U.S., the first industries to feel the pressure were technology and defense. These sectors depended heavily on Africa's mineral exports. Countries across southern Africa and the Great Lakes region were among the world's largest suppliers of cobalt, copper, manganese, chromium, and rare earth elements. Without these materials, factories responsible for producing batteries, microchips, aircraft components, satellites, and military equipment could not maintain production. Schedules analysts warned that even a one-month disruption could slow manufacturing output for the entire year. A longer freeze could cripple industries completely. But the crisis did not end with minerals. Agricultural companies, especially in the Midwest, were hit hard. For decades, U.S. farmers relied on African markets to absorb excess production of wheat, soybeans, poultry, and processed foods. Africa represented billions in annual sales that had suddenly evaporated. Storage facilities filled to capacity, forcing companies to dump its old crops or slash prices to maintain operations. Many U.S. agribusiness executives admitted privately that they had underestimated how crucial African markets had become to their survival. Meanwhile, American exporters of energy equipment, pharmaceuticals, construction machines, and transport vehicles faced their own nightmare. African countries had been steadily increasing purchases of American machinery for mining, agriculture, and energy operations over the last decade. But with the suspension, dozens of ongoing projects across East Africa and West Africa froze instantly. Contracts were paused, payments were withheld, machinery shipments were denied entry. Companies that had counted on Africa as a reliable growth market suddenly found themselves locked out. For Africa, however, this was not a moment of chaos. It was a moment of recalibration. The suspension from the U.S. forced African governments to accelerate long-standing plans to diversify their partnerships and strengthen regional integration. Trade blocs in East Africa, Central Africa, and the Sahel expanded negotiations to create unified standards for intra-African commerce. The African Continental Free Trade Area received newfound support, and border policies were adjusted to speed up the flow of goods within the continent. African nations also deepened engagement with Asia, the Middle East, and South America. China stepped in almost immediately, offering emergency supply chain support to replace halted U.S. imports. New trade routes were proposed linking African mineral corridors to Asian refiners and electronics factories. Gulf countries launched discussions to increase investment in African ports and aviation hubs. South American countries began exploring new agricultural exchange programs with West African nations to strengthen food security on both sides of the Atlantic. Everywhere, the message was clear. Africa was not scrambling to fix a crisis. it was stepping into its new geopolitical power with confidence. To reinforce this shift, several African countries implemented a series of structural reforms aimed at reducing dependence on external markets altogether. Local manufacturing incentives were expanded, export taxes were restructured to encourage value addition, and new state-backed funds were created to support African-owned logistics companies, shipping firms, and technology startups. Countries that had previously exported raw minerals began investing heavily in local refineries, smelters, and processing plants. Nations dependent on imported agricultural tools announced plans to build domestic machinery factories. Washington watched all of this with mounting unease. The U.S. had long believed that Africa's economic rise would remain tied to Western guidance. But Africa's trade suspension had proved the opposite. Instead of weakening the continent, the freeze had emboldened it, forcing African nations to rely on themselves and new allies rather than American oversight. This was the development the U.S. had feared, an Africa that realized its own value. Across Europe, the reaction was mixed. Some European countries urged Washington to negotiate concessions quickly before Africa strengthened other alliances. Others sought to take advantage of America as setback by proposing new deals with African governments, but Africa did not bite. Many African nations explicitly stated that any future partnerships must respect principles of sovereignty, industrial growth, and value retention. Europe, historically accustomed to extracting resources cheaply, found itself struggling to adapt to a new reality where Africa demanded full economic dignity. African citizens welcomed this shift wholeheartedly. For decades, they had questioned why a continent so rich in minerals, agricultural potential, and maritime routes remained economically dependent on the West. Now, people across major cities celebrated the suspension as a sign that Africa was finally reclaiming its place in the global power structure. Social media platforms across the continent filled with messages of pride, unity, and determination. Commentators emphasized that this was not an act of hostility but an assertion of economic self-respect, and yet Africa's decisions were not purely emotional, they were strategic. Officials across the continent understood that the U.S. would eventually return to negotiate, but this time Africa would be negotiating from a position of power. No more one-sided agreements, no more forced deregulation. No more subsidized imports undermining local industries, no more intellectual property rules that prevented African pharmaceutical companies from manufacturing simple medicines. Africa was preparing for a new kind of partnership, one in which the continent dictated terms based on its long-term economic goals rather than short-term foreign pressure. Meanwhile, U.S. financial markets continued to react negatively. Stocks tied to agriculture, technology, and resource extraction lost billions in value within days. Investors questioned how resilient America really was without African trade. Economic commentators debated whether Washington had overplayed its influence, failing to see the signs of Africa's increasing independence. The American public, too, began asking difficult questions. How had a continent the U.S. had long underestimated gained so much leverage? Why had policymakers ignored Africa's growing unity? And what would it take to rebuild trust? Behind closed doors, Washington's diplomats drafted urgent proposals aimed at resuming dialogue, but African nations were in no rush. They had waited decades for this moment. Now they intended to use it fully. For the first time in modern history, Africa held the upper hand in negotiations with the United States and as global powers. Watched closely, one thing became clear: the balance of global trade had shifted and it would never go back to the way it was. The morning after the sudden trade freeze, the United States found itself facing consequences far greater than any official had anticipated. Across the Atlantic and Pacific, global markets were reacting violently, not because they understood the details of the African nation's decision, but because they sensed a profound shift in the balance of power. For decades, the West had commanded the global stage with economic dominance, shaping trade frameworks and dictating the rhythm of world markets. But now, Africa had tossed a wrench into that machinery, and the ripple effects were beginning to look less like ripples and more like a tidal wave. Inside the United States, panic quietly spread through industries that relied heavily on African imports. The energy sector was hit immediately. Without access to cobalt, manganese, rare graphite, and bauxite from countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Guinea, and Mozambique, U.S. manufacturers found themselves scrambling to secure alternative supply lines. Electric vehicle producers were among the first to raise alarms, warning that battery production could fall by a projected 45% if the freeze persisted. Factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Tennessee slowed production, and some halted entirely. Workers who had never heard of cobalt or coltan suddenly found their livelihoods. threatened by commodities sourced thousands of miles away. The agricultural industry had its own crisis. Several African nations had become key buyers of American grain, soybeans, and poultry over the past 15 years. With those markets suddenly closed, U.S. farmers faced an unbearable surplus. Storage facilities filled rapidly, forcing producers to dump millions of dollars worth of crops. Prices plummeted, and the shock rippled through farming communities that were already operating on thin margins. Many recalled previous trade wars, but this felt different, deeper, more personal, and far more unpredictable. Meanwhile, African nations were experiencing a very different wave, one of empowerment and unity. Countries across West, East, Central, and Southern Africa had collectively agreed that partnerships with the United States no longer aligned with their long-term strategy. Instead, the continent redirected its focus toward intra-African trade and strategic partnerships with regions that were willing to engage on equal footing. The African Continental Free Trade Area surged with new energy as countries accelerated integration of new supply corridors, investment frameworks, and industrial projects designed to manufacture the very products they once exported in raw form. African leaders gave speeches celebrating a turning point in their global relations. They reminded their citizens that for too long their nations had been relegated to the role of raw material suppliers, trapped in the lower tiers of the global value chain. The sudden halt of trade with the United States was not just a political statement, it was an economic declaration of independence. The continent was ready to produce, process, and export finished goods, capturing the value that had been slipping through its fingers for generations. In Europe, the reaction was mixed. Some countries attempted to distance themselves from the unfolding tensions, urging African nations to separate their dispute with the United States from wider Western relations. But their pleas were ignored. For many African nations, European governments were just as complicit in decades of uneven trade structures. The halt with the United States marked the beginning of a continental reassessment of its ties to the entire Western world. As the situation escalated, the United States made several attempts to initiate emergency negotiations. Diplomats reached out to embassies in Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Egypt, Rwanda, Ghana, and Ethiopia. But the responses were uniform. Africa would not return to the table as long as the old terms remained unchanged. The continent demanded fair pricing for its minerals, equitable market access for its goods, and recognition of its political sovereignty. For the first time, the West could not corner Africa with economic pressure, because Africa had diversified its alliances over the previous decade. Asian and Middle Eastern nations sensed opportunity and acted swiftly. China increased its trade missions across African capitals, signing accelerated agreements to expand industrial parks.